It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Oak Ridge, where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. Marcus Thompson, the newly elected mayor of Oak Ridge, was driving home after a long day. He had spent hours at a community meeting discussing plans to revitalize the downtown area, a project he hoped would bring new energy and opportunities to the town. Marcus felt proud of what they had accomplished so far, but he was also tired. All he wanted now was to get home, have dinner, and relax. As he drove, Marcus noticed something odd about his car. The taillight on the passenger side was flickering, faintly. It wasn't completely out, but it was enough to catch his attention. "I'll fix that tomorrow," he muttered to himself, deciding it wasn't urgent enough to stop right then. But before he could even finish the thought, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser had pulled up behind him. Marcus sighed softly, pulling over to the side of the road. He turned off the engine and rolled down his window, waiting for the officer to approach. What happened next would change everything. Not just for Marcus, but for the entire town. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was Greg Hargrove, a name well known around Oak Ridge. Hargrove had been with the police department for nearly 2 decades, but his reputation wasn't exactly stellar. Over the years, several complaints had been filed against him, most involving accusations of racial bias. Some people whispered that he treated black residents differently, often using excessive force or speaking to them disrespectfully. None of these complaints ever stuck, though. Somehow, Hargrove always managed to avoid serious consequences. 2. Many in the community he represented everything wrong with the system. Hargrove walked up to Marcus's car with an air of irritation, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Without introducing himself or explaining why he'd stopped Marcus, he barked, "License and registration." His tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as if Marcus had committed some grave crime instead of simply being pulled over. Marcus, however, remained calm. He reached into his glove compartment to retrieve the requested documents, all while keeping his hands visible. Once he had them ready, he handed them over through the open window. Then, in a polite voice, he asked, "Officer, may I ask why I've been pulled over?" Instead of answering, Hargrove scowled. To him, Marcus's question sounded like defiance. He didn't care that Marcus was speaking respectfully or following instructions. All Hargrove saw was a black man sitting in a nice car, a man who dared to question his authority, and that made his blood boil. "Don't give me attitude," Hargrove snapped, leaning closer to the window. "You know exactly why I stopped you." Marcus frowned slightly, confused by the accusation. "Actually, I don't," he replied evenly. "If there's an issue, I'd appreciate knowing what it is." That response only fueled Hargrove's anger. In his mind, Marcus wasn't showing proper deference. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. People like Marcus, people who looked like him, were supposed to stay quiet and do as they were told. Anything else was seen as a challenge. Without warning, Hargrove yanked open the car door. "Get out of the vehicle," he shouted, his voice rising above the hum of passing cars. Marcus hesitated for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Was this really necessary? Before he could process the situation fully, Hargrove grabbed his arm and yanked him out of the car with surprising force. Marcus stumbled onto the pavement, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. Before he could regain his balance, Hargrove reared back and delivered a punch straight to his jaw. The impact sent Marcus sprawling to the ground, pain shooting through his face. For a few seconds, he lay there stunned, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What Hargrove didn't realize, and perhaps wouldn't have cared about even if he did, was that the man he had just assaulted wasn't just any ordinary citizen. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a resident of Oak Ridge. He was its mayor. Elected just months earlier, he was the first black person to hold the position in the town's history. His victory had been celebrated by many as a step forward for diversity and representation. Yet none of that mattered to Hargrove in that moment. To him, Marcus was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. As Marcus slowly pushed himself up from the ground, clutching his jaw, He locked eyes with Hargrove. There was no fear in his gaze, only disbelief and disappointment. How could someone sworn to protect and serve act this way? More importantly, how many others in Oak Ridge had endured similar treatment without anyone stepping in to help? Unbeknownst to either of them, this incident wouldn't stay hidden. A young couple walking their dog nearby had witnessed the whole thing. They quickly pulled out their phones and started recording. Within minutes, snippets of the video were uploaded to social media, sparking outrage among Oak Ridge residents. Comments flooded in, calling for accountability and justice. By morning, the story would dominate local news headlines, forcing the town to confront uncomfortable truths about race, power, and policing. For Marcus, lying on the cold pavement under the dim streetlights, the weight of the moment hit hard. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated because of the color of their skin. And as much as it hurt, physically and emotionally, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this moment pass without fighting for change. By the time Marcus Thompson managed to stand up from the pavement, his jaw throbbing and his mind racing, the scene around him had changed dramatically. The young couple who had witnessed the incident stood a few feet away, their phones still recording. Their expressions were a mix of shock and anger, but they didn't say anything. They just watched, ensuring that evidence of what had happened wouldn't disappear into thin air. Word spread quickly in Oak Ridge, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. By sunrise, the video clips captured by the couple had gone viral, not just locally but across social media platforms nationwide. People couldn't stop talking about it. Friends shared posts with captions like, "This is why we need change," while others commented angrily, calling Officer Greg Hargrove's actions unacceptable and shameful. For many, the footage was a stark reminder of how deeply rooted racism and abuse of power could be, even in small towns like theirs. But not everyone reacted the same way. As the day wore on, opinions began to split. Some residents rallied behind Marcus, praising him for staying calm despite the injustice he faced. They saw him as a symbol of resilience, a leader willing to endure personal hardship for the greater good. Others, however, weren't so quick to condemn Hargrove. In fact, some defended him outright, claiming that Marcus must have done something to provoke the officer. He shouldn't have talked back, one person wrote online. Another commented, "Cops have tough jobs. If you don't listen, things escalate." The divide grew deeper as the hours passed. Protesters gathered outside City Hall, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and no more police brutality." Many of them were black residents who had experienced similar treatment at the hands of law enforcement. They saw this moment as an opportunity to demand accountability, not just for Marcus but for all those whose voices had been silenced over the years. On the other side of the debate, supporters of Hargrove argued that the situation was being blown out of proportion. Some claimed the video didn't show the full story, suggesting that Marcus might have been disrespectful or uncooperative before the cameras started rolling. A few officers from the police department even joined the chorus, insisting that Hargrove was simply doing his job. One retired cop told a local news station, "You can't expect us to let people walk all over us. Sometimes you have to take control." As tensions mounted, so did the pressure on Mayor Marcus Thompson himself. Everyone wanted answers, from the protesters demanding justice to the city council members urging caution. Reporters camped outside his house, microphones in hand, eager to hear what he would say next. Would he call for Hargrove's immediate firing? Would he push for sweeping reforms within the police department? Or would he try to downplay the incident to avoid rocking the boat? Marcus knew he couldn't stay silent. But before he made any public statements, he needed time to think and heal. His jaw was swollen and every movement sent sharp jolts of pain through his face. Still, physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional toll the incident had taken. Sitting alone in his living room, staring at the muted television screen flashing images of the protest outside City Hall, Marcus wrestled with conflicting emotions. Part of him felt angry, not just at Hargrove, but at the system that allowed such behavior to persist. Another part of him felt weary, burdened by the weight of expectations placed on him as both a mayor and a black man in a position of authority. Meanwhile, Officer Hargrove found himself under intense scrutiny. Within hours of the incident, he was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Back at the precinct, whispers filled the hallways. Some officers avoided eye contact with him, clearly uncomfortable with the attention the case had brought to their department. Others offered quiet support, patting him on the back and telling him to hang in there. Hargrove, for his part, remained defiant. When questioned by internal affairs investigators, he insisted that his actions were justified. "I was following protocol," he said flatly. If he had complied, none of this would have happened. Despite his confidence, cracks began to form in Hargrove's defense. As the investigation unfolded, old complaints against him resurfaced, complaints that had been brushed aside or dismissed entirely in the past. Former victims came forward, sharing stories of harassment, intimidation, and excessive force. One woman recounted how Hargrove had pulled her over without cause and berated her in front of her children. Another man described being handcuffed and thrown to the ground during a routine traffic stop. Each account added another layer to the growing pile of evidence against him. Back in the community, the protests continued to grow. What started as a small gathering outside City Council turned into a massive demonstration that stretched down Main Street. Residents of all ages and backgrounds joined in, united by a shared desire for justice. Some carried candles, lighting up the night sky in solidarity. Others chanted slogans like, "Black Lives Matter," and "Enough is enough." The energy was electric, fueled by decades of pent-up frustration. For Marcus, watching the protests unfold from afar was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt proud of the community for standing together and demanding change. On the other hand, he couldn't help but feel guilty. He hadn't asked for this kind of attention. He hadn't wanted to become the center of a national controversy. All he had wanted was to serve his town and make life better for its residents. Now his personal pain had become a rallying cry for reform. That evening, Marcus decided it was time to address the public. Standing on the steps of City Hall, flanked by community leaders and activists, he spoke with a steady voice despite the bruises still visible on his face. "What happened to me wasn't right," he began, pausing to let the words sink in. "But this isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. It's about making sure our town is a place where everyone feels safe and respected, no matter who they are." His speech was met with cheers and applause, but Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never came without resistance, and already he could see the challenges looming on the horizon. Some members of the city council were hesitant to pursue disciplinary action against Hargrove, fearing backlash from the police union. Others worried that pushing too hard for reform might alienate voters in future elections. Even within his own administration, there were whispers of doubt. Could Marcus really deliver on his promises, or would he buckle under the pressure? As the sun set over Oak Ridge, casting long shadows across the streets once again, Marcus stood quietly for a moment, taking in the scene around him. The protests were winding down, but the fight was far from over. He knew that healing the wounds of the past would take time and courage. But as he looked out at the faces of his fellow residents, the morning after his speech at City Hall, Marcus Thompson woke up feeling the weight of what lay ahead. The swelling in his jaw had gone down slightly, but the ache was still there, a constant reminder of the events that had unfolded. He knew the hardest part wasn't over. It was only beginning. While the protests outside had brought attention to the issue, real change would require more than just words and slogans. It would demand action, and Marcus intended to lead the charge. His first step was to call an emergency meeting with Police Chief Linda Morales. The two of them had never been particularly close. Morales was a seasoned professional who valued order above all else, and she often viewed Marcus's progressive ideas with skepticism. But this time, there was no avoiding the conversation. The entire town was watching, waiting to see how leadership would respond to the crisis unfolding before their eyes. When Marcus arrived at the police station, he could feel the tension in the air. Officers moved about the building quietly, some avoiding eye contact altogether. A few shot him quick glances, their expressions unreadable. Inside Chief Morales' office, the atmosphere was equally charged. She sat behind her desk, arms crossed, her face set in a tight frown. Papers were scattered across the surface, reports, memos, and notes from the ongoing investigation into Officer Greg Hargrove's conduct. "Thank you for seeing me," Marcus began, taking a seat across from her. His tone was calm but firm, betraying none of the frustration or exhaustion he felt inside. "We need to talk about what happened and where we go from here." Chief Morales sighed heavily, leaning back in her chair. "I know why you're here, Marcus," she said, skipping formalities. "But I want to make one thing clear. This department has a job to do. If we start tearing ourselves apart every time someone disagrees with how we handle a situation, we won't be able to function." Marcus nodded slowly, choosing his words carefully. "I understand that policing is tough work. Nobody denies that. But when officers abuse their power, it undermines trust, not just in them, but in the entire system. And right now, our community doesn't trust us." Morales opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "This isn't about blaming everyone in uniform. It's about holding individuals accountable when they cross the line. What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. There are patterns here, patterns we can't ignore anymore." For a moment, Morales didn't respond. She stared at him, weighing his words. Finally, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Fine," she said curtly. "Let's say we agree something needs to change. What exactly do you propose?" Marcus had expected resistance, so he came prepared. Pulling out a folder from his briefcase, he laid out a series of proposals designed to address both immediate concerns and long-term issues. First, he called for transparency in the investigation into Hargrove's actions. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, should be made public once the inquiry was complete. Second, he suggested implementing mandatory bias training for all officers, not as a punishment but as a way to foster understanding and improve interactions with the community. Third, he proposed creating a civilian oversight board to review complaints against police officers, ensuring accountability beyond internal investigations. As Marcus explained each point, Morales listened intently, though her expression remained guarded. When he finished, she exhaled sharply. "You realize these changes won't come without pushback," she warned. "Some of my officers will see this as an attack on the department. They'll think you're siding with the protesters, instead of supporting them." "I'm not trying to pick sides," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm trying to protect everyone, officers included. If people don't trust the badge, then officers are put in danger too. Trust works both ways." The room fell silent as Morales considered his argument. After what felt like an eternity, she finally nodded. "All right," she said reluctantly. "I'll present your proposals to the city council. But don't expect this to be easy. You're going to have enemies on both sides." Marcus smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "I already do," he admitted. "But if we don't take steps toward progress now, when will we? This is our chance to show Oak Ridge and the rest of the country that we're better than this." Later that day, news of the proposed reforms spread quickly, igniting fresh debates throughout the town. Supporters praised Marcus for taking bold action, while critics accused him of overstepping his authority. Among the loudest voices of dissent were members of the police union, who saw the reforms as an affront to their profession. At a hastily organized press conference, Union Representative Tom Grayson slammed the mayor's plans, calling them unnecessary and divisive. "We've got good men and women risking their lives every day to keep this town safe," Grayson declared, his voice rising with indignation. "And now, because of one incident, they're being painted as villains. That's not fair." Predictably, Grayson's comments sparked outrage among activists, who argued that protecting bad actors within the department did more harm than good. Social media lit up with heated arguments, hashtags trending under banners like "Accountability Matters" and "Protect and Serve All." For every person defending the police, there seemed to be another demanding justice. Amidst the chaos, Marcus remained focused. He spent hours meeting with community leaders, listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into the reform plan. He also reached out to national organizations specializing in police reform, seeking advice on best practices. Slowly but surely, the framework for meaningful change began to take shape. Still, the pressure mounted. Some council members urged Marcus to soften his stance, warning that pushing too hard might alienate key allies. Others suggested delaying the reforms until tempers cooled. But Marcus refused to back down. "If we wait for the right time, it'll never happen," he told them during a tense council meeting. "People are hurting now. We owe it to them to act." Meanwhile, Officer Hargrove found himself increasingly isolated. Suspended without pay and facing mounting evidence of past misconduct, he became a pariah within the department. Even those who had initially supported him began to distance themselves, fearing guilt by association. Friends stopped answering his calls, and neighbors avoided him at the grocery store. For the first time in his career, Hargrove felt truly alone. One evening, unable to sleep, he poured himself a drink and sat in front of the television, flipping through channels aimlessly. Everywhere he looked, there were reminders of the scandal, the news anchors dissecting his case, the commentators debating whether he deserved leniency or termination. Each report felt like a punch to the gut, compounding the shame and anger boiling inside him. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Hargrove switched off the TV and grabbed his coat. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to find them. The next morning, Marcus received a call from Chief Morales. Her voice was tense, almost hesitant. "Hargrove showed up at the station last night," she informed him. "He wants to speak with you directly." Marcus froze, unsure of what to say. Meeting with Hargrove was risky. It could easily be seen as confrontational or inflammatory. But deep down, Marcus knew avoiding the issue wouldn't solve anything. If they were ever going to move forward, they needed closure. "All right," he said finally. "Set it up, but let's make sure it's handled carefully." What happened next would test Marcus's resolve and force both men to confront truths neither was ready to face. The meeting between Marcus Thompson and Officer Greg Hargrove took place in a small, windowless room at the police station. The space was deliberately neutral. No badges on the walls, no symbols of authority to tip the scales in either direction. A single table sat in the center, flanked by two chairs. Chief Linda Morales stood nearby, arms crossed. Her presence meant to ensure civility, but also to serve as a buffer if things escalated. When Marcus entered the room, he found Hargrove already seated, his posture rigid and his jaw clenched tightly. There was no handshake, no greeting, just an icy silence that filled the air like static electricity. Marcus pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. For a moment, neither man spoke. The tension was palpable, heavy enough to press down on anyone who dared step into the room. Finally, Hargrove broke the silence. His voice was low and gravelly, laced with bitterness. "You think you're so special, don't you?" he said, glaring at Marcus. "Walking around like you own this town now, like you're better than everyone else." Marcus didn't react immediately. He studied Hargrove's face, searching for something beneath the anger, regret maybe, or even fear. But all he saw was defiance. Still, he kept his tone calm and measured. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Marcus replied. "But I do believe everyone deserves to be treated fairly. That includes me, and it includes the people you swore to protect." Hargrove scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Fairly? You want to talk about fairness? What about what's fair to us? To officers who put their lives on the line every day, while people like you sit behind desks making decisions you don't understand?" Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, intrigued despite himself. "People like me?" he asked. "What does that mean exactly?" "You know what it means," Hargrove shot back, his voice rising. "You're just another politician playing the victim card, using your skin color to get attention. Well, guess what? Not everything is about race." Marcus let out a slow breath, resisting the urge to raise his voice. He had expected denial, deflection. This wasn't new territory. But hearing those words spoken aloud still stung. "If it's not about race," he said evenly, "then why did you treat me differently? Why did you pull me out of my car and punch me when all I did was ask a question?" For the first time, Hargrove hesitated. His eyes darted away briefly, before returning to meet Marcus's gaze. "You were disrespectful," he muttered, though his conviction wavered. "You challenged my authority." "I asked a simple question," Marcus countered. "Something any citizen has the right to do. If asking why I was pulled over counts as disrespect, then we've got bigger problems than just you and me." Hargrove opened his mouth to argue but stopped short. Instead, he looked down at the table, his fingers drumming nervously against the surface. The bravado that had carried him through most of the conversation seemed to falter under Marcus's steady composure. For a fleeting second, there was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of vulnerability. Chief Morales shifted uncomfortably in the corner, sensing the shift in dynamics. She cleared her throat softly, reminding them both of her presence. "Let's stay focused," she interjected, her tone firm but not unkind. "This isn't about assigning blame, it's about finding a way forward." Marcus nodded, turning his attention back to Hargrove. "Look, I'm not here to ruin your life," he said, his voice softer now. "But what happened that night can't be ignored. People are hurting, not just because of what you did to me, but because of everything that came before. Every complaint, every accusation, every person who felt powerless to speak up. This isn't just about one incident. It's about accountability." Hargrove's hands balled into fists on the table, his knuckles whitening. "So what? You expect me to apologize? Grovel at your feet like some guilty dog?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "An apology won't fix anything, not unless it comes with real change, and that starts with admitting what went wrong." The room fell silent again, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Hargrove stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment it seemed like he might double down, refuse to acknowledge any wrongdoing. But then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him, replaced by something quieter. Resignation. I didn't mean for it to go that far," Hargrove admitted gruffly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's just, sometimes you get frustrated. Sometimes you see someone who looks like they don't belong, and you assume the worst. Doesn't make it right. But it's hard to turn off that switch once it's flipped." It wasn't a full confession, nor was it an outright apology, but it was progress, or at least the beginning of it. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly why we need to change the system," he said. "Because assumptions like that hurt people. They destroy trust. And without trust, nothing works." Hargrove didn't respond immediately. He sat there staring at the table, his mind clearly racing. Whether he truly understood the gravity of his actions remained unclear. But for now, the confrontation had reached its limit. Any further discussion would only lead to frustration and stalemate. As they stood to leave the room, Chief Morales stepped forward, addressing both men. "This isn't the end," she reminded them. "There's still work to be done. For all of us." Her gaze lingered on Hargrove, conveying a mixture of disappointment and determination. Then, without another word, she ushered them out of the room. Back outside, the protests continued, though their tone had shifted slightly. News of the reforms proposed by Marcus had spread, reigniting hope among supporters. Activists applauded the mayor's willingness to tackle systemic issues head-on, while skeptics urged caution, warning that promises alone weren't enough. Meanwhile, within the police department, reactions to the proposed changes varied wildly. Some officers embraced the idea of bias training, seeing it as an opportunity to improve relationships with the community. Others dug in their heels, viewing the reforms as an attack on their profession. Despite the backlash, Marcus pressed on. He worked tirelessly to finalize the details of the reform plan, collaborating with experts and consulting residents at every turn. Public forums were held, weekly, giving people a platform to share their thoughts and concerns. Slowly but surely, the framework for lasting change began to take shape. For Hargrove, however, the road ahead was bleak. Suspended indefinitely and facing termination, he struggled to find employment elsewhere. Applications sent to neighboring departments went unanswered, and private security firms turned him away without explanation. Without the structure of the job he'd clung to for decades, Hargrove spiraled into isolation, spending his days drinking and brooding over what might have been. One evening, unable to bear the silence of his empty apartment, he drove to the edge of town and parked near the riverbank. Sitting alone in the darkness, he replayed the events of the past weeks in his mind. The confrontation with Marcus, the mounting evidence against him, the loss of everything he'd built. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might have been wrong. Not just about Marcus, but about so much more. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. And as Hargrove sat there staring at the water rippling under the moonlight, that whisper grew louder than ever before. But for Marcus, the fight was far from over. While Hargrove faded into obscurity, the mayor turned his focus toward rebuilding trust, one step at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Marcus Thompson found himself at the center of a delicate balancing act. On one side were the residents of Oakridge, many of whom still carried deep wounds from years of mistrust and injustice. On the other side stood the police department, an institution grappling with its own identity crisis as it tried to adapt to sweeping reforms. The tension between these two groups was palpable, a constant undercurrent threatening to erupt if not handled carefully. For Marcus, healing this divide wasn't just about policy changes, it was about rebuilding relationships, fostering understanding, and creating space for honest conversations. To tackle this monumental task, Marcus launched what he called the Oakridge Unity Initiative. It was more than just a slogan. It was a series of programs designed to bring law enforcement and the community together in meaningful ways. One of the first initiatives was a series of town hall meetings held across different neighborhoods. These weren't your typical dry, bureaucratic gatherings. They were raw, emotional, and often uncomfortable. Residents were invited to share their experiences, good or bad, with officers present in the room. At the first meeting, held in the basement of a local church, emotions ran high. A young woman named Tasha stood up, her voice trembling as she recounted how an officer had stopped her late at night while walking home from work. "He made me sit on the curb for 20 minutes, she said, tears streaming down her face. "I hadn't done anything wrong. He didn't even tell me why I was being questioned. All I could think about was my dad. He's been pulled over so many times, always for no reason. And now here I was, sitting there like some criminal." The officer sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Another resident chimed in, describing a similar experience but adding that they'd been handcuffed during the encounter. As story after story poured out, the atmosphere grew heavier. Some officers looked defensive, others visibly shaken, but Marcus remained steadfast, encouraging everyone to keep speaking. "This isn't easy," he told the crowd. "But we won't heal unless we're willing to listen, to really hear each other." Slowly, something remarkable began to happen. After several meetings, a few officers started responding, not defensively, but empathetically. One veteran cop admitted that hearing these stories made him realize how intimidating uniformed officers could seem, especially to young people or minorities. Another confessed that she'd never considered how certain actions might be perceived differently by someone who'd experienced discrimination before. These small admissions didn't erase years of pain, but they planted seeds of hope. In addition to the town halls, Marcus introduced community service projects where officers partnered with residents to clean parks, repaint schools, and organize food drives. At first, participation was low. Many officers felt awkward working alongside people who clearly distrusted them, while some residents worried the effort was nothing more than a PR stunt. But over time, barriers began to break down. Conversations sparked naturally during these events. about families, hobbies, shared frustrations with rising living costs. Gradually, officers and residents saw each other not as adversaries but as neighbors. One particularly memorable project took place at Oak Ridge Park, where volunteers gathered to build a new playground. Officer Daniels, a burly man known for a sauce, his gruff demeanor, worked alongside Malik, a teenager who'd once been stopped and frisked without cause. At first the two barely spoke, exchanging only terse instructions about tools and materials. But as the day wore on, Malik noticed Daniels struggling to lift a heavy beam. Without hesitation, he stepped in to help. "You don't have to do that," Daniels muttered gruffly, though gratitude flickered in his eyes. "Yeah, well, someone's got to save you from throwing out your back," Malik replied with a smirk. They both laughed. The ice finally broken. By the end of the day, they were joking and trading stories about their favorite sports teams. It was a small moment, but it symbolized the kind of progress Marcus had envisioned. Human connection cutting, through years of division. While these efforts gained traction, challenges persisted. Not everyone supported the reforms, or Marcus himself. Some officers resented what they saw as forced apologies, feeling unfairly targeted for problems they believed stemmed from broader societal issues. Others quietly resisted changes, dragging their feet when it came to attending training sessions or participating in community events. Meanwhile, certain segments of the population accused Marcus of going too far, catering to criminals at the expense of law enforcement. Letters criticizing his leadership flooded City Hall, some signed anonymously, others bearing names bold enough to demand accountability. Despite the backlash, Marcus refused to waver. He knew that real change required patience and persistence. Every setback was an opportunity to learn, every criticism a chance to refine his approach. When officers complained about bias training, Marcus arranged follow-up discussions to address their concerns. When protesters criticized the pace of reform, he reminded them that lasting solutions couldn't be rushed. "We're building bridges," he often said. And bridges take time. Behind closed doors, however, Marcus wrestled with doubts. Late at night, sitting alone in his office, surrounded by stacks of reports and proposals, he sometimes wondered if he was fighting a losing battle. Could one person truly make a difference in a system so deeply entrenched? Was he asking too much of a town still divided? These questions haunted him, but they also fueled his determination. If he gave up now, what message would that send? For Greg Hargrove, life had taken a sharp turn into obscurity. Unable to find work in law enforcement and ostracized by former colleagues, he retreated further into isolation. Days blurred into nights as he spent hours drinking alone, replaying the incident with Marcus over and over in his mind. Sometimes he convinced himself it wasn't entirely his fault, that anyone else in his position would have reacted the same way. Other times guilt gnawed at him, whispering truths he wasn't ready to face. One evening, while flipping through old photo albums, Hargrove stumbled upon pictures of his early days on the force. Back then he'd been idealistic, eager to make a difference. He remembered the pride he'd felt pinning on his badge for the first time, vowing to protect and serve. Somewhere along the way, that sense of purpose had faded, replaced by cynicism and anger. How had it happened? Had he let bitterness cloud his judgment? Or had the system itself failed him, turning him into someone he no longer recognized? Hargrove didn't have answers, but the questions lingered, haunting him like ghosts. Though he never publicly apologized, those private moments of reflection hinted at a glimmer of remorse, a fragile beginning to personal redemption. By the end of the year, signs of progress emerged. Crime rates in Oak Ridge dropped slightly, thanks in part to improved communication between residents and police. Surveys showed a modest increase in public trust toward law enforcement, though skepticism remained. Still, for Marcus, these incremental victories mattered. Change wasn't instantaneous, it was a slow, steady climb uphill. Standing at the podium during a holiday celebration, Marcus addressed the crowd with quiet optimism. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice warm yet resolute. "But our journey is far from over. Healing takes time, courage, and commitment. Together, we can create a future where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. As applause rippled through the square, Marcus looked out at the diverse faces gathered before him. Young and old, black and white, officers and civilians standing side by side. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared, but hope burned brighter than ever in Oak Ridge. Months turned into a year, and Oak Ridge began to feel like a different town. Not perfect, but undeniably changed. The scars of the past were still visible, etched into the memories of those who had lived through them, but they no longer dictated the rhythm of daily life. Slowly, the fractures that had once divided the community started to mend, stitched together by shared effort and newfound understanding. For Marcus Thompson, this transformation was both a personal triumph and a testament to the resilience of the people he served. The Unity Initiative, which had begun as an ambitious experiment, evolved into something far greater, a cornerstone of Oak Ridge's identity. Town hall meetings became regular fixtures in the community calendar, drawing crowds eager to voice their thoughts or simply listen. What had once been tense confrontations transformed into constructive dialogues, where residents and officers alike learned to see each other as individuals rather than stereotypes. Even skeptics admitted that these gatherings helped humanize both sides, breaking down walls built over decades of mistrust. One particularly memorable meeting took place on a crisp autumn evening at the local library. A middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had always been vocal about her distrust of law enforcement, stood up hesitantly. Her hands trembled as she held the microphone and her voice cracked with emotion. "I used to think all cops were the same," she confessed. "But after working alongside some of you during the cleanup projects, I realized you're just people trying to do your job. It doesn't mean everything is fixed, but it gives me hope." Her words brought murmurs of agreement from the audience, followed by applause. An officer seated nearby nodded solemnly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. These moments of connection weren't rare anymore. They were becoming the norm. Beyond. The town halls, the ripple effects of Marcus's reforms continued to spread. The mandatory bias training sessions, initially met with resistance, gradually gained acceptance among officers. Many came to appreciate the insights they provided, helping them navigate complex situations with empathy and patience. One officer, Officer Ramirez, became a vocal advocate for the program, sharing how it had reshaped his approach to policing. "Before, I'd walk into a situation thinking I already knew what was going on," he explained during a panel discussion. "Now I take a step back and ask myself, am I seeing the full picture? Is there another way to handle this?" Community. Service projects also flourished, expanding beyond park cleanups to include mentorship programs for at-risk youth. Officers volunteered as coaches for local sports teams, tutors for after-school programs, and guest speakers in classrooms. These interactions fostered mutual respect, showing young people that authority figures could be allies rather than adversaries. For many kids growing up in Oak Ridge, this shift in perception was profound. It gave them role models they might not have otherwise had. Meanwhile, the Civilian Oversight Board proposed by Marcus proved to be one of the most impactful changes. Comprised of diverse members representing various sectors of the community, the board reviewed complaints against officers impartially, ensuring accountability without undermining morale. Its creation sent a clear message. Transparency mattered, and everyone, officers included, would be held to the highest standards. As trust between residents and law enforcement grew, so did collaboration on public safety initiatives. Crime rates dropped further, thanks in part to neighborhood watch programs co-led by police and civilians. Residents reported suspicious activity more readily, knowing their concerns would be taken seriously. Officers, in turn, responded with professionalism and care, reinforcing the bond they'd worked so hard to rebuild. For Marcus, the journey hadn't been easy. There were days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, when criticism from all sides made him question whether he was doing enough or too much. Yet every time doubt crept in, he reminded himself why he'd started this fight in the first place. It wasn't just about justice for himself. It was about creating a legacy of equality and fairness for future generations. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. National media outlets began covering Oak Ridge's transformation, highlighting it as a model for other towns grappling with similar challenges. Marcus was invited to speak at conferences and seminars, sharing his story and offering practical advice for leaders hoping to enact change. His speeches resonated deeply, blending humility with conviction. Real progress isn't measured by headlines or accolades, he often said. It's measured by the lives we touch and the bridges we build. Despite the national spotlight, Marcus remained grounded, refusing to let praise inflate his ego. He continued attending town meetings, shaking hands and listening intently to feedback. To the people of Oak Ridge, he wasn't just a mayor, he was one of them, a neighbor committed to making their home better for everyone. Greg Hargrove, meanwhile, faded further into obscurity. Unable to find steady employment and shunned by former colleagues, he struggled to adapt to life outside the force. Some days, he considered reaching out to Marcus, perhaps apologizing publicly for his actions. But shame and pride kept him silent, trapping him in a cycle of regret. Occasionally, he drove past City Hall, watching from afar as the community he'd once policed thrived under new leadership. Each glimpse reinforced the distance between his old self and the man he wished he could become. Still, glimmers of redemption occasionally surfaced. During a chance encounter at a diner, Hargrove struck up a conversation with a young waitress who recognized him. Instead of lashing out or avoiding him, she offered a kind word. "I heard you've had a tough time," she said softly. "But nobody stays lost forever. Maybe there's still a way for you to make things right." Her compassion startled him, planting a seed of possibility in his heart. One sunny spring morning, Oak Ridge unveiled a new memorial in the town square, a tribute to victims of police brutality and systemic injustice. The monument featured quotes from civil rights leaders, alongside names submitted anonymously by residents. At its base was an inscription, "In memory of those who suffered silently, so that others may speak freely." Marcus delivered a speech at the unveiling ceremony, his voice steady yet filled heartfelt emotion. "This memorial isn't just a reminder of pain," he told the crowd. "It's a promise that we will never forget the lessons of the past, and that we will continue striving for a brighter future. Change doesn't happen overnight, nor does it come without sacrifice, but together we've proven that compassion and courage can overcome hatred and fear. This is just the beginning." As applause echoed through the square, Marcus looked out at the faces gathered before him, young and old, black and white, officers and civilians standing side by side. In their eyes, he saw determination, resilience, and hope. Though the road ahead would undoubtedly present new challenges, Oak Ridge had shown itself capable of growth and renewal, and in that moment Marcus knew the fight for justice was worth it.